In 1898, a new wonder drug hit the shelves of pharmacies across the globe. It was marketed by Bayer, the same company that gave the world aspirin, as a non-addictive miracle for the most vulnerable members of society, children. It was hailed as the cure for the white plague of tuberculosis and the common winter cough. Mothers were encouraged to give it to their fussy toddlers to help them sleep, and doctors praised its sedative qualities. The name of this miracle cure? Heroin. This is the story of how one of the world's most feared narcotics was once sold as a family-friendly household staple, and the corporate marketing machine that ignored a mounting body count for over a decade. To understand the tragedy of heroin, we have to look at the landscape of 19th century medicine. This was an era where the world was literally coughing itself to death. In the smog-choked cities of the Industrial Revolution, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and whooping cough weren't just medical terms. They were the primary architects of the graveyard. Tuberculosis alone accounted for nearly 1/4 of all adult deaths in Europe, but its toll on children was even more savage. In an age before antibiotics, the only effective way to suppress the violent rib-cracking spasms of a consumption cough was opium. But opium was a messy, inconsistent ancient remedy. It was known to cause morphinism, a state of lethargic addiction that the Victorian medical world viewed more as a moral failing than a physical disease. The world was desperate for a safe sedative, a clean, laboratory-grade solution to the chaos of the natural poppy. Enter Heinrich Dresser, the head of Bayer's pharmacological laboratory in Elberfeld, Germany. In 1897, Dresser's team was obsessed with the idea of improving morphine. They wanted to strip away its addictive properties while magnifying its potency, creating a substance that could suppress a cough without chaining the patient to a dealer. A young, brilliant chemist named Felix Hoffmann, the same man who had synthesized a stable form of aspirin just 11 days prior, was tasked with the experiment. By adding 2 acetyl groups to the morphine molecule, he created diacetylmorphine. He had unwittingly invented a substance that could cross the blood-brain barrier with terrifying speed. But to the scientists in the sterile labs of Elberfeld, it looked like they had simply perfected nature. When Dresser tested the compound on himself and his workers, the feedback was unanimous and intoxicating. They didn't just feel relief, they reported feeling heroic. They described a sense of immense well-being, an artificial bravery, and a total absence of pain. Bayer's marketing department immediately seized on this specific adjective, trademarking the name heroin. They believed they had found the holy grail of chemistry, a drug that possessed all the pain-killing and cough-suppressing power of opium, but with none of the morphinism or chemical chains. To Dresser, this was the pinnacle of human achievement, a scientific breakthrough born of pure hubris. He famously declared that heroin was 10 times more effective than morphine as a respiratory medicine, and Bayer prepared to sell this heroic molecule to every nursery in the world. Bayer's marketing campaign was a masterpiece of Victorian propaganda and corporate aggression. In an era before the FDA or stringent drug trials, Bayer didn't just sell heroin. They sold it as the safer, gentler alternative to aspirin. While aspirin was marketed for the aches of the working man, heroin was positioned as the guardian of the domestic sphere. Throughout the early 1900s, Bayer's global machine produced thousands of free samples, promotional calendars, and lush, colorful advertisements printed in over 20 languages, reaching from the pharmacies of London to the rural clinics of the American Midwest. Bayer's strategy was two-pronged: win over the doctors with scientific prestige and win over the mothers with the promise of peace. One of the most chilling artifacts from this era was a 1912 Bayer advertisement featuring 2 children reaching for a bottle of heroin syrup on a high shelf. The copy was soft, almost lullaby-like, promising that it clears the chest and promotes sleep for the restless child. It was sold in every conceivable form: chocolate-coated pills, soothing syrups, and even as a heroin-laced salt for inhalation. To the Victorian mother, whose child might be kept awake for days by the barking cough of pertussis, this bottle wasn't just medicine, it was a miracle in a vial. But behind the scenes, the science was a house of cards. Bayer's own researchers had barely tested the drug for more than a few weeks before the global rollout. By 1899, barely a year after the launch, reports began to flood in from doctors in New York and Philadelphia. They weren't seeing heroic recoveries, they were seeing a new kind of ghost. Patients who had started the drug for a simple winter cold were now appearing at hospitals with the hollow eyes and skeletal frames of classic opiate addicts. When doctors raised the alarm, Bayer didn't pull the product. Instead, they launched a masterclass in corporate gaslighting. They published papers claiming that heroin was actually a cure for morphine addiction, and that any patient who became hooked on heroin was simply predisposed to weakness, blaming the victim's biology for the drug's inherent chemistry. They continued to push the non-addictive label for nearly 15 years, funding biased studies and silencing dissent, even as heroinism became a recognized international medical crisis. Why was heroin so much more dangerous than the morphine it was meant to replace? The answer lies in the blood-brain barrier, the body's most secure biological checkpoint. Morphine, while powerful, is water-soluble. It struggles to penetrate the fatty defenses of the brain, leading to a slower, more manageable onset. But by adding those acetyl groups, Hoffman had made the molecule highly lipophilic. It loved fat. Because the brain is largely composed of fatty tissues, heroin acts like a chemical ghost, slipping past the body's natural defenses and into the central nervous system with terrifying, frictionless speed. Once inside the brain, the trap is sprung. Heroin itself doesn't actually kill the pain, it is a prodrug. Enzymes in the brain immediately strip away those acetyl groups, converting the substance back into morphine, but it does so inside the fortification. It is a Trojan horse strategy. This results in a concentrated, lightning-fast flood of narcotics hitting the mu opioid receptors all at once. The heroic feeling the Bayer scientists reported was actually the brain's reward system being hijacked by an artificial surge of dopamine so intense that the body immediately began to downregulate its own natural endorphins. The first dose didn't just provide relief, it began the process of neurological restructuring. For a child, this was a death sentence disguised as a sedative. A child's respiratory center is notoriously fragile, and heroin's primary medical effect was the suppression of the cough reflex through the brainstem. But the dose required to stop a cough was dangerously close to the dose that stopped the drive to breathe entirely. As the miracle syrup flooded their systems, the children would fall into a deep narcotic stupor. The peaceful sleep mothers observed was actually a state of hypoxia. In many documented cases, a child given just a spoonful for a midnight cough would simply slip into a coma and stop breathing before dawn. They didn't die of their illness, they died of a corporate-sponsored overdose, their tiny lungs silenced by the very heroic molecule promised to save them. The end of the heroin era didn't come because of a sudden burst of corporate conscience. It came because the social cost was tearing the fabric of 20th century civilization apart. By 1910, the heroic veneer had completely eroded. In cities like New York, the medical community was reporting a terrifying new phenomenon: heroin junkies, a term derived from the addicts who collected scrap metal, junk, to fund their habit. The very hospitals that had once prescribed the drug were now being overrun by patients whose withdrawals were so violent they were physically indistinguishable from the dying. The political tide began to turn with the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act in the United States, which finally forced companies to list heroin on the label. For the first time, mothers realized the soothing syrup they were feeding their toddlers was the same substance causing a crime wave in the streets. But Bayer fought back with every legal resource available, clinging to their patent and their profits. It wasn't until the 1912 International Opium Convention at The Hague that the drug was officially categorized as a global menace. Under intense international pressure and facing a PR nightmare that threatened their other pharmaceutical interests, Bayer finally ceased production of heroin in 1913. However, the damage was irreversible. By the time Bayer walked away, they had already saturated the global market with a highly concentrated, easily manufactured narcotic that was far more addictive than the opium that preceded it. When the legal supply vanished, the black market surged to fill the void. The heroin name, which Bayer had spent millions to associate with German scientific prestige and nursery safety, was permanently reclaimed by the streets. It became the definitive symbol of the darkest corners of human experience, a legacy of addiction that would persist for over a century. Bayer eventually pivoted back to their other 1897 discovery, aspirin, which became the most successful drug in history. They spent decades trying to scrub the Heroin for Kids campaign from their corporate records, rebranding themselves as the Aspirin Company. But history is a permanent ledger. The Bayer heroin campaign remains the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when the profit motive is allowed to outpace the scientific method, and when the lives of the most vulnerable are traded for a miracle in a bottle. Today, we look back at the Heroin for Kids ads with a mixture of horror and disbelief. We wonder how a society could be so blind. But the ledger reminds us that every era has its miracle drugs and its corporate wonder cures. The lesson of Bayer isn't just about a single molecule, it's about the danger of the non-addictive promise. If you want to see the dark side of more medical miracles, subscribe to The Ledger. Next time, we investigate the 1892 fingerprint that trapped a killer. I'm Apothecary Archives, and this has been The Poisoner's Ledger.